Went on a dance on Saturday night on the old White Hills High. But she lived on 20th floor of town. The elevator's broken down, so I walked up to 5, 3, 5, 4, 5, 6, 7, 5, 8, 5 more. I'm on the on the ready to drag. 5th and the 4, I'm starting to drag. That's the top now, I'm too tired to rock. Well, she called me up on the telephone. Said, come on, baby, I'm all alone. Said, baby, you're mighty sweet, but I'm in bed with the aching feet. This went on for a couple of days, but I couldn't stay away. So I walked up to 5, 3, 5, 4, 5, 6, 7, 5, 8, 5 more. I'm on 12, I'm ready to drag. From the 4, I'm starting to drag. That's the top now, I'm too tired to rock. Here we go, boy. Sent to Chicago for repairs. Said it's fixed, I'm using the stairs. Oh, 30 before it's too late. Well, I'm a little too much to wait. All this time is getting me down. Find my coat draped over the rail. So I'll walk 1, 2, 5, 3, 5, 4, 5, 6, 7, 5, 8, 5 more. 12, I'm ready to drag. 5th and the 4, I'm starting to drag. That's the top now, I'm too tired to rock. Take it away. At the top, I'm too tired to rock. Last time, please.
Welcome to the Friends of Dan Music Podcast. I'm Dan Miles. You've been listening to Colin Hicks and the Cabin Boys. That was their 1958 cover version of Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock, featuring the energetic drumming of 19-year-old Jimmie Nicol. 6 years after that recording, Nicol was invited to tour with the Beatles when Ringo Starr became unexpectedly ill and they found themselves in need of a substitute. Considering the public's ravenous appetite for all things related to the Beatles, my guest today, Jim Berkenstadt, was surprised by how little was known about Nicol and embarked on an extensive research expedition that ultimately resulted in a book which he published in 2013 called The Beatle Who Vanished. Jim has also written some other interesting books, which we're going to talk about, and is the founder of the Rock and Roll Detective, a company which provides research services for high-profile music industry clients, including Buddy Holly's widow, Maria Elena, Elvis Presley guitarist Scotty Moore, acclaimed drummer Jim Keltner, artist/bassist Klaus Voormann, the Traveling Wilburys, the estate of George Harrison, the Beatles, and more. I've really been looking forward to speaking to him about all this, so let's get him on the line. Joining me on the phone from Madison, Wisconsin is Jim Berkenstadt. Welcome.
Hey, thanks, Dan. It's a real honor to be on your show. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, before we get to your books, I want to talk a little bit about some of the projects you've worked on in your capacity as the Rock and Roll Detective. That name, by the way, is not something that you came up with. Rather, it was bestowed upon you by longtime Beatle insider Neil Aspinall, was it not?
I think that's right. I think he once referred to me as that one day when we were chatting about some other projects and things.
Yeah, well, it's apt. It's good. It's good for branding, and also, it was an accurate observation, as we'll find. I know you were involved with Cirque du Soleil's Love production in Vegas,
right?
Which features the music of the Beatles, and I know that it was George Harrison himself who personally recommended you for that project. What was your contribution to it?
Well, Actually, George, I think, recommended me in general to Apple several years before that, and but it just so happens that was one of the projects that came up. And my involvement with the Cirque du Soleil project was they had an area in the middle of the show where they wanted the audience to actually hear the Beatles' voices talking, joking, whether it was in the studio or at press conferences and such, to just sort of convey the sheer joy and fun that these four guys had when they were together. And so, my specific assignment was between this period and that period, we'd like to hear and have you locate, every single press conference where they're, where it's really good sound quality and they're joking around and that sort of thing. And so I think that was the pretty much the specific goal of that. And then they took those sorts of things and mixed them in as well with in-between song chatter when they were recording at EMI Abbey Road Studios, and made this really pleasant montage for the show.
Yeah, I haven't seen the show, but I saw the documentary about it, so I've seen film footage of it, and I do have a sense of the silhouettes. I imagine, it's a pretty physical show. They probably want to have give those dancers a break, get a breather.
Right, I think that is it, and also some of the people who play multiple roles get a chance to actually change their costumes.
Yeah.
It gives everybody a little bit of a break, but it's also really fun for the fans to really feel like they're right there with the Beatles.
Right, because even though the press conferences were, for the public, a lot of those things, they haven't been heard since the 60s. And then,
right.
The studio stuff, some of that stuff probably hasn't been heard at all. So there's that exclusive aspect of it, too.
Yeah, it was a wonderful project, and it continues to entertain people year after year.
Yeah, I plan to go. I mean, I'm in Arizona. I actually was in Vegas a couple years ago for business, and I drove there, so it's not that far. And
Right.
I just don't want to keep putting it off and just take for granted it'll always be there. And then
That's right.
when I finally get there, it closed last week. I've seen pictures of you at the premiere with Paul and Ringo. Was that the first time you ever met them?
Actually, let me think about that. I think I had met them both before that. I had met Paul McCartney as far back as May of 1976 when Wings came to Chicago Stadium, and I happened to have a seat in the sort of the photographer or orchestra pit right by his piano.
Wow.
So it was very exciting to see him come down the steps during a break in the show. He came down with Linda, and it's funny, he turned to me and my buddy and said, well, what do you think so far? And we were just like, first we were, of course, in shock, and then we answered, it's the greatest rock and roll concert we've ever been to.
Well, 76, I mean, come on, the Beatles had done a studio album 6 years prior to that. It was pretty fresh.
Yeah, it really was, and the thing that really struck us was no one had ever seen this Live and Let Die performance before with the explosions, and we literally were blown off of our seats because we were sitting too close to those pots that explode, and we had no idea. And then I think I had met Ringo at like his first art opening in New York several years before that, and but anyway, it's fun to meet them, and that was a wonderful show, that premiere, and then to be able to go to their VIP after party was about the coolest party that you could ever imagine, one thrown by the Beatles. They know what they're doing when it comes to throwing a party.
Yeah, they got a little experience at that. It's a shame that George didn't live long enough to see that show, because wasn't it his idea? He was friends with the Cirque du Soleil guy. He said, why don't you do a show with our music? You call my friend Jim for your little press conference audio, and then he wasn't able to see it. It's a shame.
It is a shame that George didn't get to see it.
Well, after he passed away, you suggested to his wife, Olivia, that she needed to take the initiative and tell George's story herself rather than letting someone else do it, which resulted in the Living in the Material World documentary that was directed by Martin Scorsese. And you're credited as a historical consultant on the film. So for that project, what did your services entail?
Well, that was about a 3-year project, and it was a lot of fun and really interesting. Different things, over the course of those years. One would be, for example, to create a very detailed chronology of events, for example, that led up to the concert for Bangladesh. I think another was to, occasionally they might say, we need an old Beatles teen fanzine from this particular year, and we're looking for the one that has such and such on the cover. Or it might be, I guess the most interesting things were going to New York and seeing segments of the film or components of the film, and sitting with David Tedeschi, the editor, and having him run them by me and say, if anyone knows if this stuff's fresh or has been around and seen a long time, it would be you. So we would like, you to, tell us as we show you these segments, because our goal is to not only present a great portrait of George Harrison and his life, but also we want, even the most hardcore fans to be impressed with the fact that we've dug up some really new, fresh material. Right. And I think they did a good job with that.
They did. I actually noted some things. I think there was a picture of George playing, it looked like it was about from 1963. He had a cigarette lighter he was using as a slide, which I thought was really odd because, he didn't play slide guitar till a long time after that, and It was so early. There was another one they were dressed like matadors or something. You had to kind of freeze frame to see it. Also, some of the performances from Anthology, like Blackpool, they'd grab Money, That's What I Want. You could tell it was the same concert, but it wasn't the same tunes like Yesterday and Help and Ticket to Ride that were in Anthology. So I got the sense that they were making an effort not to duplicate those things.
Right.
Now,
they even found some early, I think, might have been 61 or 60, some footage of the Beatles, but it was silent film. And then we were able to figure out what song George was singing lead on, and which I can't even remember. But then we were able to patch in his vocals from, I think, one of the Star Club Hamburg performances.
Well, that's cool. I had to do a little lip reading there, huh?
Yeah.
Now, his house is massive, so I imagine Olivia probably found, boxes of things. Did she give you any things and say, look, could you please date and catalog and identify this? I have no idea what it is. Or was there any of that, or was it more public stuff?
A lot of one of the things she did right off the bat, I think, was she got a guy over in England to start cataloging things that, and a lot of things that were there, I'm sure, were labeled by George. There have been times where she might say, Jim, I'm looking for a film clip that I recall where George is in front of a mirror with those sort of makeup light bulbs around it. Can you find out where that's from and who owns that? So we might take a look at a good quality, version and possibly license it. Things like that. So
a lot of it was just they're banking on your existing knowledge as a shortcut to getting to these things.
Yeah, and I think in many cases, I've been lucky and fortunate, and my brain works well enough to remember some of those things, or at least it helps me to, what the clues she might have kind of helps me to narrow it down.
Well, that's how I was able to tell that photo was probably from about 63, just by George's hair and kind of how he was dressed.
Hair length.
Yeah.
And outfits. I remember one of the clips they showed me, they were wondering what time period it was from, and I said, well, he's wearing the Cracker Box Palace video sweater. So, let's look up the date of that, and you'll know the general time period, because he was seen wearing that sweater in pictures and videos for, maybe over a few-month period or something.
Well, of course, Olivia herself would know a lot more about the 70s when she actually got with him than the Beatle years when they didn't know each other. I know a lot of people who say that George is their favorite Beatle, so it's nice to see a documentary focused on him for a change. And John and Paul are both mentioned throughout, of course, but always from George's point of view.
Yeah, I thought it was great to have Olivia and Martin Scorsese tell his story. If you don't do something like that, then there's always the possibility that others will create videos and they won't be as accurate, in telling the story.
No, it was very good advice you gave her, and, to give her that advice and then end up with this documentary by this acclaimed director, that's pretty badass, Jim.
Well, I don't know that I can take credit for that.
Well, because it's just me talking to you, we'll let you take credit for that. I'm going to give you credit for that.
No, I think we have to give a lot of credit to Olivia, because Olivia obviously knew that sort of thing and knows a lot more than people know, because she has been in the record business for many years, even before meeting George. So.
Yeah, she's shrewd. She seems like a nice person, but she also seems shrewd. George wouldn't have spent time with anybody who wasn't, present mentally. Well, let's talk about a book you wrote called The Black Market Beatles.
Okay.
In the early chapters, you discuss the history of bootlegging just in general terms, and then you go on to provide a comprehensive catalog of Beatle bootlegs specifically. You also included comments from the Beatles themselves concerning their personal attitudes towards bootlegging, and you even interviewed some of the most prominent Beatle bootleggers. It was interesting to hear what they had to say. You indicated in the book that a bootleg called The Complete BBC Sessions was the impetus for the official Beatles Live at the BBC release, which turned out to be a multi-platinum seller and really demonstrated how Apple was sort of indifferently sitting on this gold mine of material that people really wanted to hear and buy. So would it be fair to say that both that and the Anthology project were a response to bootleggers?
Well, first of all, again, I can't take any credit for the Beatles BBC. It was a bootleg that someone put out. I found it to be pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I wasn't giving you credit for that one. I'm saying
I don't want any credit.
No, they put out this you just mentioned it in the book, but put out like a 9 or 10 disc complete BBC thing that everybody wanted, and they thought, well, we better do a real one. Everybody's buying this. There's a demand for it. We can have more control and maybe do a better quality one. What I mean a response is like if that thing isn't floating around out there, maybe they don't get the idea to release BBC recordings.
Yeah, I suppose. Well, and this even goes back to someone had bootlegged the Wings 76 LA show, which was the impetus for Capitol and McCartney to put out an official version, and someone had bootlegged Concert for Bangladesh, which was really a no-no because, the money from not only the ticket sales but also the recordings and the film would be, used for humanitarian purposes.
Right.
And then if you go all the way back to 64 and 65, Hollywood Bowl became, at some point was bootleg, the Beatles at Hollywood Bowl, and then in the mid to late 70s, Capitol put out a version of a combined version of the Beatles at Hollywood Bowl. So, those things have been going on for a long time, where people go, maybe we should put this out and do a good job. And I think Apple's done a great job with putting out not just the BBC recordings, but the anthology. I thought was fantastic. I don't know if we were a blueprint or not, because it kind of depends upon when our book came out and when they were actually culling music out. But I think that a lot of the ones we recommended in the book as being kind of the most interesting bootlegs did sort of coincidentally end up being on that set.
Yeah, I think your book came out in, 95, and so did Anthology, right? Or it came out in 96, Anthology.
I think
they're close.
The book was officially released, either in late 94 or early 90.
Your book definitely came out first, and you talked about If You've Got Trouble, which you recommended nobody ever hear, and which they sort of apologized for in the liner notes, that song. Leave My Kitten Alone, you'd mentioned, George's Acoustic, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and a lot of other things. In my case, I saw Anthology, and I read your book recently, so I had the cart before the horse, but it's just interesting sort of the timing, and I'm not saying that they read the book and said, well, you need to put these things out, or you mentioned Hollywood Bowl or Wings Over America. It was probably a factor, but I got the feeling that the bootleg market was relatively small compared to commercial releases. But, now regardless of supply and demand, do you think it should be left up to the artist to decide what does and does not get released?
Yeah, I do, because it's their work, and if you think about, Dan, if you were to record a show and said, this is garbage, you'd want the right to be able to just erase it or store it and not have anyone ever hear it. Yep. And similarly, if I wrote a book or an article and I wanted to crumple it up and throw it in the garbage, I wouldn't feel good if someone, went out into the garbage and pulled it out and put it out. So I do think the artist should have the right to decide what they want to do, but the problem is if you go all the way back to the turn of last century, That all changed when a guy named Lionel Mapleson went up into the balcony at the New York Met and started bootlegging the famous operas of that time period. Ones that weren't necessarily meant to be recorded. So, it's always been a push and a pull between bootleggers who like artists and make recordings and the artists themselves.
Yeah, the opera bootlegging was an interesting part of your book. That was interesting to read. I completely agree in principle, but hypocritically, I also do want to hear all that stuff. Not necessarily, a terrible Paul Simon performance or something that would embarrass them. I heard a Led Zeppelin bootleg once. I was really excited, I'm going to hear this thing. And whoever was recording it, there was some girl standing next to him. Oh. And she was constantly cheering and yelling, and she was like 3 times louder than the band. It was very distracting. It was very irritating. It was like you were in the room with her, and Zeppelin was like in the next room or something. So, that soured me there on.
I understand your perspective. Sure, a lot of people feel that way. They don't care. They just want to hear it. They want to hear everything by their favorite artist. And I think we, tried to, in that book, Scott Belmer and I tried to present both sides of the discussion and just leave it up to the reader or the music fan.
One thing that's important to remember, as you did point out in the book, is that bootlegs have value beyond just entertaining fans. They also have educational value. Music scholars love to analyze them, particularly in the case of the Beatles, to learn more about, the craft of this band who was the most successful act of all time. So
Right.
And of course, the Beatles don't look at it that way. If they're trying to write "Don't Let Me Down" or something, and they're running through it 57 times, it's not. They never want to go back and hear that.
Right.
But we want to hear it because there's different. They tried these different harmony vocals. It didn't work out. A rhythm change here and there. So, a musical scholar might want to study it. But that's, as you pointed out, there's pirating. There's counterfeiting and there's bootlegging, and there are 3 different things.
Right.
And so, I think it's good for somebody to read that book just to learn the history of bootlegging and what's really involved. And of course, a huge factor in bootlegging was the arrival of digital technology. Because you usually had this thing of you were getting a copy of a copy of a copy, and you had sound degradation issues. Yeah. Where you could everybody could get like a first generation, and so you pointed out that some of the bootlegs started to sound better than commercial releases, and
some cases.
Yeah, in some cases, just a few, to the point that people became suspicious if it was coming from master tapes.
Well, I think in some cases, master tapes or safety copies of masters were, stolen or leaked out. Even, there aren't that many studios financially alive anymore in this country because everyone's, working in their basement with a laptop. But even to this day, there are studios that will sort of secretly tape things going on and have, a tape recorder going 4 rooms away, and, the artists don't know that's going on, and then things leak out, and now it's all free file sharing, and people download from blogs and things.
Oh, yeah, with digital, once it's out, and it's so easy to distribute once it's out. It's not like you have to go into a vinyl record store and there's a secret room in the back and you have to get something with a white cover, and it's not like that anymore. You can pass it around.
Those were the good old days.